Marco Polo, the merchant who conquered the world. Imagine Venice in the 13th century. A maze of canals shining under the sun, busy bridges and markets buzzing with sounds, smells and voices from all parts of the world. In this vibrant setting, Marco Polo was born in 1254, into a family of merchants. His father, Niccolò, and his uncle, Maffeo, were famous sailors and traders, men who had crossed lands beyond what many could imagine. From a young age, Marco heard stories about these distant lands, endless deserts, cities with towers of gold and powerful rulers who controlled vast empires. But for him, these stories were as real as the fairy tales that circulated in the streets of Venice. Until everything changed. When Marco was 15 years old, his father and uncle returned from an extraordinary trip. They had been to the heart of the Mongol Empire, in the lands of the legendary Kublai Khan. They brought back not only riches but also an audacious request. The great Khan wanted them to return, bringing representatives of Christianity and gifts that could strengthen the ties between two worlds. It was the moment that would change Marco's life forever. In 1271, at just 17 years old, Marco set out with his father and uncle towards the east. The journey was risky, a trek across deserts, mountains, and treacherous seas. While many of his peers were busy with local businesses or family responsibilities, Marco faced the vastness of the unknown. Can you imagine what it was like to leave your home not knowing if you would ever return? It was more than courage. It was a mix of insatiable curiosity and the certainty that the world had something greater to offer. It was in this context that Marco began to transform from a young merchant into an explorer. His destiny was sealed, but he didn't know yet. His journey would not only change his life, but also shape how the West would view the East for generations. Imagine a journey where every step was a dive into the unknown. For Marco Polo, the path from Venice to the distant East was more than just a line on shaky maps. It was a crossing that tested the limits of the body, mind, and faith. Right at the start, the group faced adversities that could make anyone give up. The scorching heat of the Persian deserts made their eyes burn and their throats dry, to the point where every drop of water was a treasure. The desert winds, called fire arrows by the locals, could swallow entire caravans in sandstorms. But Marco, in his youth, saw each difficulty as a lesson. He watched the nomadic guides, learning how to read the signs of the stars and find water where no one else could. But the physical dangers were just part of the challenge. The cultural conflicts and mistrust between peoples from such different regions created constant tensions. Many distrusted the Venetian merchants, thinking they could be spies or opportunists. Marco, with his ability to quickly learn languages, took on the role of mediator, easing tensions and creating alliances with diplomacy and intelligence. After crossing the arid lands of Persia, the group encountered a new enemy, the mountains of Afghanistan. Snow-covered peaks, narrow trails, and avalanches were constant threats. Marco wrote about this part of the journey with a mix of fascination and terror. It felt like the sky itself was about to collapse on us, he later recorded in his memoirs. The altitude affected all travelers, causing fatigue and sickness. For weeks, hunger was a constant presence, and many fellow travelers did not survive. Marco, however, found strength in his insatiable curiosity. He asked questions to the locals, wrote down details about their customs, and never missed an opportunity to learn something new, even when everything seemed lost. After 3 years of facing deserts, mountains, and stormy seas, the group finally reached the court of Kublai Khan. The sight was almost unreal, a vast palace of marble and gold, surrounded by gardens that seemed to spring from the imagination of a poet. The Khan, sitting on a throne that symbolized his power over one of the largest empires in the world, received the travelers with curiosity. Marco, despite his youth, surprised the Khan. His willingness to listen, learn, and understand Mongol culture made him a unique figure. He was not just another merchant seeking wealth. He was a man fascinated by the diversity and complexity of the world. Kublai Khan, seeing this potential, began to trust Marco, entrusting him with important missions in lands that were unknown even to the Mongols. But this new position brought new challenges. Now Marco was immersed in a network of political intrigues, territorial disputes, and constant dangers. Every decision he made carried the weight of either pleasing or displeasing the Khan. One mistake could cost him his life. At the court of Kublai Khan, Marco Polo encountered a world few Europeans could imagine. The vast audiences in the imperial hall were grand ceremonies, filled with rituals and showmanship. The Khan, a man of great insight, ruled with absolute authority but also with curiosity about the world beyond his empire. It was this curiosity that led him to give Marco Polo a unique position, special emissary of the court. Marco now had a mission that went far beyond being just a simple merchant or travel companion. He traveled through lands that were, to the Western world, only myths. From Tibet to Burma, from the Chinese coastline to the Mongolian steppes, Marco was sent to explore, observe, and report. These trips, however, were not just learning opportunities. They were full of dangers. On one of his first missions, Marco was tasked with negotiating with a rebellious ruler in a distant region. The territory was hostile and rumors of betrayal circulated in the camp. During the meeting, Marco sensed the growing tension. At any moment, the smallest mistake could trigger a deadly conflict. His ability to understand local customs and show genuine respect avoided a confrontation, earning the respect of both his enemies and allies. It was during these journeys that Marco began to realize the true greatness of the empire he served. He saw cities bigger and more organized than any in Europe. He experienced advanced technologies such as the use of paper money, and marveled at the discipline of the Mongol troops. More than that, he began to see cultural differences not as barriers, but as learning opportunities. In a visit to Hangzhou, one of the richest and most populous cities in the empire, Marco described a place of unimaginable beauty. Perfectly planned canals, vibrant markets, and a government system that seemed to work with flawless efficiency. It was there that Marco felt the impact of his journey. He was witnessing a world that challenged everything he knew and believed about civilization and progress. However, the definitive turning point in Marco's life came when Kublai Khan asked him to stay permanently at the court. Marco was torn. On one hand, he felt honored by the Khan's trust and knew there was still much to learn. On the other hand, the longing for Venice and his family began to weigh heavily on him. He dreamed of sharing all he had seen, but he knew the journey back would be as dangerous as the journey there. This dilemma reflected something bigger. Marco was no longer the same young merchant who had left Venice. He now saw the world with new eyes, understanding the complexity and interconnectedness of human cultures. Yet he knew that to complete his transformation he would need to face more challenges and make choices that would shape the rest of his life. The years Marco Polo spent as Kublai Khan's emissary brought a wealth of experiences that few would ever know. He traveled through vast and dangerous lands, participated in crucial negotiations, and witnessed the rise and fall of regional leaders. However, over time he began to feel the weight of being a foreigner in such a vast empire. At the court, Marco was admired for his intelligence and diplomatic skill, but he also faced suspicious glances. Many Mongols viewed with reservations the fact that a foreigner held a prominent place in the Khan's trust. Rumors and intrigues emerged behind the scenes. Marco had to learn to navigate a political terrain full of traps, where one wrong step could mean his downfall or even death. During a diplomatic mission to Tibet, Marco faced the greatest test of his courage. The caravan was ambushed by highway robbers, who demanded riches and made death threats. While many succumbed to panic, Marco used his cunning and knowledge of local customs to negotiate their release. Instead of giving in to the robbers, he managed to convince them that the caravan was carrying gifts destined for the Khan himself, something no one would dare steal. His ability to turn adversity into opportunity began to be noticed even by his adversaries. External challenges were only part of the story. Inside himself, Marco faced an even deeper battle, the struggle to reconcile the man he had become with the young merchant who had left Venice. He felt proud of everything he had accomplished, but the longing for home and the desire to share his experiences with his homeland were growing stronger. In his notes, Marco began to reflect on the lessons the East had taught him. He admired the pragmatism of the Mongols, the discipline of the troops, and the Khan's openness to learning from other cultures. He also marveled at the technological and social innovations he witnessed: paper money, efficient communication networks, and cities that surpassed in organization everything he knew. Marco realized that his journey was not just physical, but also spiritual and intellectual. He was transforming into someone who could see beyond the prejudices of his time, someone who viewed the world as a rich, interconnected tapestry of cultures. After nearly 2 decades in Kublai Khan's service, an opportunity to return arose. The empire was beginning to face internal instability, and Marco knew his position at court was becoming increasingly fragile. Additionally, the Khan was aging, and his death could mean the end of the relatively safe environment that Marco and his family had found. But the journey back would be as challenging as the journey there. The group would have to cross treacherous seas and territories now marked by conflicts. The decision to leave required courage and meticulous planning. For Marco, leaving the court was not just a physical farewell, but an emotional one. He knew he was leaving behind a world that had deeply shaped who he had become. Marco embarked on the return journey with a mix of sadness and hope. He carried with him not only material riches but also a treasure of stories, knowledge, and experiences that would change the way the West viewed the East. When Marco Polo decided to leave Kublai Khan's court, he had no idea that the journey home would be the greatest test of his life. The journey would not be a simple crossing. It was a constant battle against nature, time, and uncertainty. The maritime route chosen for the return, passing through the Indian Ocean, was particularly treacherous. For months, The crew faced violent storms that seemed to tear the masts from the ships. The raging seas swallowed entire vessels, and fear hung over everyone. Marco recorded in his diary the endless nights when the sailors rowed with all their strength, while he wondered if he would ever see Venice again. The sea journey was only part of the trial. Upon reaching new lands such as the islands of Sumatra and Sri Lanka, Marco and his caravan faced unexpected dangers. Pirates lurked in the waters, ambushing the shores and forcing the group to maintain constant vigilance. On land, diseases began to spread among the crew. Marco saw many companions succumb to fever and hunger, while he himself fought exhaustion and doubt. Despite all this, Marco remained determined. He understood that it was not just a physical journey, it was an emotional and spiritual crossing, a symbol of his will to complete the cycle he had started nearly 25 years earlier. Finally, after nearly 3 years of travel, Marco arrived at his homeland. But the return was bittersweet. Venice, which once seemed so familiar, now felt strange. Marco was no longer the young merchant who had left. He was a man marked by experiences few could understand. Upon entering the city, he discovered that his family had changed, his home was no longer the same, and many did not believe the stories he told. To his fellow Venetians, descriptions of distant lands and wonders such as golden palaces, vast cities, and exotic customs seemed like fabrications. Marco faced mockery and disbelief, but he refused to be discouraged. Over time, he decided that his stories needed to be preserved. Imprisoned during a war between Venice and Genoa, Marco found an unlikely companion in his cell, Rustic Hello of Pisa, a writer. Together, they began recording Marco's adventures in a book that would later be known as the Book of Wonders. Marco Polo's climax was not a battle or a physical conquest, but the publication of his memoirs. He had faced raging seas, impassable mountains, and distrust from all sides. Now, by turning his journey into words, he brought the East to the West, expanding the horizons of a Europe that scarcely knew what existed beyond its borders. The writing was a struggle in itself. Marco had to decide how to convey the wonders he saw without losing authenticity, while Rustic Hello used his literary skill to make the text compelling. Together, they created an account that would fascinate kings, explorers, and merchants for generations. The publication of the Book of Wonders marked a turning point. Even though many doubted the truth of his stories, they awakened curiosity and inspired an explorer's spirit that would last for centuries. Marco not only survived the journey, he shaped the way the world viewed the unknown. When Marco Polo finally settled in Venice, after years of travels that transformed his life and understanding of the world, he did not seek riches or power. For him, the greatest treasure was sharing the wonders he had witnessed. However, his return was not as triumphant as he might have imagined. Many Venetians saw him as a stranger in his own land. The clothes he wore, his manner of speaking, and even his body language had changed. Marco was, by Venice's standards, a man of the East. His stories about a vast and well-organized empire, where gold and spices flowed like rivers, sounded more like fairy tales than real accounts. Despite the doubts, Marco found solace in his family, who remained by his side. He began investing in local trade and resumed his public life in Venice, but never abandoned his passion for recounting his experiences. In his heart, he knew that his adventures had to be more than personal memories. They had the power to inspire others to look beyond their borders and seek the unknown. Marco's greatest triumph was not only surviving journeys that defied logic and the human body, but also transforming his experiences into a timeless work. The Book of Wonders, written in collaboration with Rustic Hello of Pisa, became one of the most influential texts of its time. The book described lands Europeans could hardly imagine. Ivory and gold cities, endless deserts where the wind whispered ancient stories, and an empire so vast it seemed impossible to comprehend. Marco detailed technologies like paper money, the use of coal as fuel, and organized postal systems, innovations that seemed magical to his contemporaries. Although many doubted the veracity of his words, the impact of his work was undeniable. Explorers like Christopher Columbus carried copies of the book with them, seeking inspiration and guidance for their own adventures. Kings and merchants began dreaming of the riches of the East, and Europe's narrow vision began to expand. Marco Polo spent the rest of his life in Venice, surrounded by his family and the exotic objects he had brought from his travels. He passed away in 1324 at the age of 70, leaving a legacy that would endure for centuries. His last words, according to reports, were a reaffirmation of his stories. "I have only told half of what I saw." These words encapsulated the essence of his life. Marco knew that the world was vast, complex, and full of mysteries that no one could ever fully understand. He was more than a merchant or adventurer. He was a storyteller, a visionary who challenged the limits of his time. Centuries after his death, the name Marco Polo continues to be synonymous with exploration and curiosity. His legacy goes beyond the pages of his book. He opened the eyes of medieval Europe to the grandeur of the world. His travels inspired not only explorers but also scientists, cartographers, and dreamers. More than any wealth or achievement, Marco Polo left a powerful message. The true value of exploring the world lies not in what you can gain, but in what you can learn. He showed that the boundaries between cultures can be crossed, and the unknown should not be feared but embraced. Centuries have passed since Marco Polo chronicled his adventures, but the ripples of his journey continue to echo. The Book of Wonders became a beacon for navigators, merchants, and dreamers, an invitation to curiosity and exploration. Even in the most closed-off times, his words opened doors to the unknown. Europe, inspired by his descriptions, entered an age of discoveries that would redefine history. Explorers like Christopher Columbus carried copies of his stories, dreaming of exotic lands and boundless riches. Trade routes between the East and West began to flourish, creating a flow of ideas, cultures, and goods that would transform the world. Marco's influence transcended the borders of his time. He is remembered not just as an explorer, but as someone who proved that dialogue between cultures is possible, necessary, and enriching. His ability to observe, learn, and respect the other marked the beginning of a global vision that still shapes the world today. In the end, the story of Marco Polo is much more than that of a merchant-turned-adventurer. It is a testament to the courage needed to face the unknown, the importance of seeking truth beyond borders, and how every step toward the horizon can transform the way we see the world. Perhaps the greatest lesson Marco left us is this: The limits of the world are, in fact, the limits of our imagination. He dared to see beyond the walls of Venice, and in doing so he expanded the horizons of all humanity. If Marco could see the impact of his life today, he might smile upon realizing that his stories continue to be told. After all, he was a man who lived between worlds, carrying pieces of each within his soul. His spirit lives on in every person who dares to dream, explore, and learn. And so his journey never truly ends. Every time someone opens a map, embarks on a ship, or tells a story of distant places, a part of Marco Polo is there, reminding us that the world is still vast and the unknown still awaits us.